They thought they were restoring a house. Instead, they opened something that had been trying very hard not to be found. A thin, ordinary-looking notebook sealed inside a forgotten drawer, carrying a voice that was never meant to survive the Gilded Age. During the restoration of the Vanderbilt mansion known as the Breakers, workers carefully dismantled a heavy piece of furniture in the servants' wing, just another item on a long checklist of repairs, when they found that drawer, jammed tight, lined with dust older than any living memory. Inside, wrapped in fabric gone brittle with time, lay the diary of the head housekeeper. Dated entries, precise observations, notes written in a hand that understood both the power of detail and the danger of recording it. In an era defined by hierarchy, discretion, and retaliation, a written account from someone in her position is not just rare. It is almost a contradiction in termos, a small act of resistance against a world built to erase people. Like her from the official record, the pages do not read like gossip. They read like a ledger kept in the shadows of the golden halls above. Mentions of dinners that never appeared in society columns, guests whose names were never entered into the household register, conversations held in rooms that, official meant, were not in use that night. She notes when the newspaper coverage does not match what she saw with her own eyes, when an accident is described as unfortunate, but was preceded by weeks' detention and private meetings, when a public speech celebrating progress follows, de forma convenient, a closed-door agreement in the family's private study. Names vanish from guest lists, but not from her memory. Letters arrive by special courier and leave by firelight. Transfers of staff happen without explanation precisely after particularly delicate evenings. Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion? One in which the least visible person becomes the most reliable witness? As railroads expanded and fortunes multiplied, the Vanderbilt name was presented to the public as a monument to ambition, industry, and refinement. However, in this diary, those same years are marked by notes about doors that had to remain unlocked after midnight, about carriages arriving without lights, about instructions to serve certain men in windowless rooms without servants nearby. There are references to letters that should leave no trace, to documents read once and then burned, to decisions made around polished tables that would later reshape investments, jobs, and entire districts without any public debate. This channel exists to reveal what the elite tried to erase, so subscribe before you lose sight of it. And in cases like this, the question is different. What to do when the truth is not in large archives, but trapped between the pages of a notebook that shouldn't exist? The diary offers no explanations. It offers fragments. A date here, a discrepancy there, a note about a policy that appears in the house records only once, but appears multiple times in his private notes. It is the tension between what the official records say and what this single notebook insists on recording that transforms this object into something more dangerous than a simple household record. If this case reminds you of another sealed room or a forgotten heir, it is because the pattern is familiar: reputation above transparency, image above responsibility, silence above testimony. And so to understand why this diary shouldn't exist and why someone hid it so well, we need to go back to the beginning, to the day the restorers opened, almost by accident, that seemingly unimportant drawer in the service wing of the Breakers. She would not have called herself important. In the great hierarchy of the Vanderbilt world, her name did not belong on marble plaques or in newspaper columns. It belonged in ledgers, in payroll lists, in the precise ink lines that kept the servants' wing running like a machine. And yet, inside the house, her word could rearrange a day. The head housekeeper sat at a point where the golden age glamour of the family and the silent labor of the staff met and collided. If a guest arrived unexpectedly, it was her schedule that bent. If a dinner ran late, it was her responsibility to ensure every lamp was lit, every corridor was clear, every door that should stay closed remained closed. In mansions like the Breakers and Biltmore, the head housekeeper moved through spaces that most visitors never even knew existed. Narrow back staircases, service corridors that wrapped around forbidden rooms, storage closets where extra table settings were kept ready in case the number of guests changed at the last minute. She handled the lists of guests, of staff, of deliveries, of rooms prepared and rooms never to be entered without explicit instruction. She knew which bedrooms were used only in summer, which salons were opened only for certain surnames, which doors in the family wing had keys that almost no one in the staff was supposed to see. While the Gilded Age shone in the front, she kept its machinery turning in the back. Her own path into that position was, in many ways, typical for the time and, at the same, quietly revealing. A girl from a modest but respectable family, perhaps from New England or across the Atlantic, with enough education to write clearly and keep accounts, enough discipline to enforce rules, and enough self-control to see and not react. Over years of service, she climbed from maid to lady's maid, from lady's maid to assistant, until finally, the keys to the linen closets, storerooms, and service schedules were handed to her. With that promotion came a new set of responsibilities, managing reputations as carefully as tablecloths, making sure mistakes disappeared before they reached the ears of the family or the curiosity of the press. From her position, she became the quiet center of what you might call Golden Age secrets. She stood at doorways when voices rose behind them, listening not by choice, but because she needed to know whether to dismiss the staff early or prepare extra rooms. She organized last-minute dinners for guests whose names did not fit neatly into the official social circle, and then watched those names disappear from the record the next morning. She was present when trunks arrived late at night and were taken not to guest rooms, but to small locked spaces on upper floors. She heard orders given in low tones, the kind that carried the weight of money, scandal, and the fear of headlines. The diary she kept does not read like a confession. It reads like a secondary chain of command. Each entry is dated, clipped, almost dry. That restraint is precisely what makes it so unsettling. One evening in the 1890s, for example, she writes of a dinner that was not supposed to happen. No description of the menu, no gossip about the dresses, no sentimental commentary. Just the fact that the dining room was laid for a specific number of guests whose presence had not been recorded in advance, that the family insisted on a particular room being used instead of the usual grand hall, that the staff was instructed to circulate with unusual discretion and to avoid direct eye contact with one of the male guests. The official house register for that night, preserved separately, lists only a quiet family supper. In that discrepancy between what the Gilded Age mansion's records say and what her notebook insists on preserving, you begin to sense the shape of a different story. This was a woman for whom precision mattered. She was responsible for ensuring that rooms were ready, that hidden heirs did not cross paths with the wrong visitors, that staff who had seen too much were quietly reassigned. When she notes that a dinner should not have happened, it is not a moral judgment. It is an operational red flag. It suggests that, from the perspective of the household's own system, the evening violated the rules designed to keep appearances intact. Her voice matters because of where she stood, between the front of the house and the back, between public image and private logistics. When a politician arrived through the main entrance during the day, the newspapers might mention it, and the visiting card might be stored in a silver tray. When that same man, or someone like him, arrived after midnight through a side door, with only a single carriage lamp burning, she was the one who made sure a path was clear, that curtains were drawn, that no unnecessary eyes lingered in the wrong corridor. She became a silent witness not out of curiosity, but because the system made her responsible for keeping the dark legacy of the house from spilling into the open. In many Gilded Age mansions, loyalty was demanded, but it was also measured. Staff who asked too many questions found themselves transferred to distant properties, or dismissed with references that ensured they would never work in a house of that stature again. Newspapers of the time rarely mentioned servants by name, and public archives almost never recorded their perspectives. That is why a diary like this, kept by someone at the core of the household hierarchy, feels almost like contraband. It is a record written from inside the machinery of power, without the filters of public relations or legal counsel. When you stand in front of a notebook like this, written by someone who saw everything from the inside, would you really dare to read every page? Or would part of you prefer not to know how deep the erased records go? Her daily life was bound to the rhythms of wealth, mornings dictated by breakfast trays and coal deliveries, afternoons by fittings and callers, evenings by formal dinners timed to impress or intimidate. But between those routines, small anomalies began to cluster in her entries. A corridor in the family wing that needed to be kept empty at specific hours without explanation. A room on the upper floor that was suddenly to be dusted but never entered fully, always with the door left half open, as if the very act of stepping across the threshold were a violation. A guest whose title appears in her diary but never in the published society pages. A man who stayed only one night yet required an unusual level of privacy and staff coordination. She notes which staff are told to stay on and which are sent away early on. Special evenings. She marks in neat ink when a coachman is replaced shortly after driving a particular route, when a maid is encouraged to seek employment elsewhere after witnessing a late-night argument near one of the forbidden rooms. None of this is explained, interpreted, or embellished. It is simply laid out, line after line, like an inventory of incidents that someone, someday, might need to reconstruct. In an age when families like the Vanderbilts could influence not only finances but also how their stories were told, this quiet list becomes a challenge to their control. The more you follow her handwriting across the pages, the more the house itself begins to feel different. The grand staircase and glittering halls seen in photographs become just one layer. Behind them, a second map emerges. Service stairs, concealed doors, narrow passageways where silent witnesses moved unseen. At a certain point in the diary, she mentions a task that seems almost administrative: updating the EEG's room assignments in a household ledger. It is only when you compare that ledger to her private notes that a small, unnerving detail emerges. One of the rooms she references again and again, a room connected to that dinner that was not supposed to happen, does not appear on the official floor plan stored with the estate's papers. On the paper, meant for archives and historians, there is only blank wall where, according to her, a door should be, and on the line where that room's number once stood. In the household ledger, there is nothing now but a name carefully, thoroughly, crossed out. From the street, the Breakers was everything the Gilded Age wanted the world to see. Granite and marble catching the Atlantic light, terraces opening onto manicured lawns, carriage drives sweeping in slow curves that suggested wealth could smooth any angle it touched. Newspapers described the house as a testament to American ambition, proof that a family which began with steamships and railroads had climbed all the way to European-style grandeur. Photographers were invited to capture the facade, the great hall, the glittering staircase. What they were not invited to see were the rooms where no camera was ever allowed, and the evenings when the house was full, but officially, nothing had happened at all. The diary returns to this contrast again and again, almost as if the head housekeeper were keeping two parallel ledgers in her mind. On one page, the public image, charity balls, receptions. For visiting dignitaries, teas in honor of ladies whose names appeared regularly in society columns from New York to Newport. On the other page, the unrecorded gatherings, dinners, without photographers, as she calls them, nights when the staff was told that all doors to the main hall were to remain closed while tables were laid in smaller interior salons that never appeared in published descriptions of the Vanderbilt home. The Gilded Age loved to present its excess as refinement, but the Golden Age secrets of this house were stored in spaces designed precisely to avoid spectacle. Outside the gates, the country was changing fast. Factories multiplying, immigrant labor swelling the cities, labor disputes simmering just beyond the reach of polite conversation. Wealth like the Vanderbilt fortune depended on railroads, shipping, investments in industries where working conditions were fragile and regulation thin. Publicly, the family aligned itself with progress and philanthropy. Donations to cultural institutions, visible support for churches, patronage of the arts. The press, selective and easily steered, repeated the narrative. When strikes threatened rail lines or scandals touched industrial partners, the emphasis in print fell on unfortunate misunderstandings, temporary disruptions, and the promise of swift resolution. In the diary, those same weeks are marked with neat lines about sudden visits from men whose names never appear on guest lists, about late-night suppers ordered for 3 or 4 people after the rest of the house was dark. One entry, dated a few days after a highly publicized charity event, notes the unusual preparation of a small dining room on an upper floor. Linen and china equal to any grand dinner, but without the orchestra, flowers, or extra staff that would normally accompany such display. The housekeeper records the arrival of 2 carriages by the side entrance after dusk. Curtains drawn, lamps dimmed. She is instructed to choose only staff who ask no questions, and to ensure that no one from the main hall passes near that corridor. The following morning, the society pages praise the Vanderbilt generosity and mention a quiet period of rest after so much entertaining. In the official household book, the date is marked simply as a day of family only. In her notebook, that same day is annotated with 3 words: "No cameras tonight." Part of what makes these notes so delicate is that they never say outright what was decided in those forbidden rooms. There is no direct statement of deals agreed or names bought. What we have instead are patterns. A private dinner followed by a subtle shift in the employment of a particular manager in a Vanderbilt-linked enterprise. A series of closed-door meetings before a major announcement in the financial pages. The sudden appearance of a distant relative in the house, described only by initials, whose presence coincides with quiet discussions about succession and estate planning. To the outside world, the logic of inheritance and succession followed carefully polished stories about deserving sons and prepared heirs. Inside, the diary hints at hidden heirs and inconvenient branches of the family tree, managed not through public acknowledgement, but through discreet arrangements made far from the eyes of the press. The machinery behind this control extended beyond the mansion walls. Families like the Vanderbilts understood how archives worked and how easily they could be shaped. Official records were kept in offices downtown, in law firms, in banks. They were written in the language of contracts and trusts, courted by men in dark suits. But beneath those polished documents ran a second stream of information. Conversations in lamplit studies, unsigned letters delivered by hand, drafts of agreements that never reached the safe. When newspaper editors visited the house for grand events, they were received in the visible spaces: ballrooms, libraries, galleries lined with paintings. On other evenings, when the risk of scandal was too high, when labor unrest or political backlash loomed too close, the house opened itself to different kinds of visitors, and the only witnesses were servants who had been trained to look away, and one woman who quietly chose to look and write. In this sense, her diary becomes a kind of negative image of the official Gilded Age. Where the public record insists on order, she notes exceptions. Where society columns praise stability, she records sudden changes. Staff removed without warning, suppliers replaced after long years of service, planned events canceled without explanation. Some of her entries are almost painfully subtle. She might remark that a particular set of place settings was used, ones reserved only for the most sensitive guests, or that a hallway outside a particular study was to remain empty for hours, with chairs removed so that no one could even pause there by accident. Each small detail suggests a household rehearsed in the art of protecting its dark legacy, of keeping the risk of scandal outside the frame. Manipulating the press was not unique to this family, of course. Throughout the Gilded Age, wealthy dynasties learned how to trade access for favorable coverage, how to invite reporters into the right rooms and keep them out of the wrong ones. A flattering article about an art donation could soften questions about working conditions on a railroad. A photograph of a hostess in a shimmering gown on a marble staircase could distract from rumors about an industrial accident or a hushed-up dispute over inheritance. The diary never uses the phrase erased records, but it is there between the lines, when she notes that a photographer expected for a particular evening was quietly told his services would not be needed after all, or when embroidered invitations for an event are printed and then never sent. What emerges as you read is the sense of two agendas running side by side inside the same walls. One is the story crafted for the outside world, philanthropic, cultured, stable. The other is the story the house had to manage in private. Contested wills, unwanted attention from regulators, alliances with men whose reputations were useful but dangerous. The head housekeeper stands precisely at the junction of these two narratives. She is the one who receives calls from editors asking about future events, and also the one who hears, in passing, that a particular guest must never be seen here again. She distributes seating charts for public dinners, and she arranges anonymous place settings for unacknowledged visitors whose names are never written down where others might read them. Because so many of the people she writes about are now gone, silent witnesses who served, observed, and then disappeared from the record, her calm, measured script becomes almost the only surviving counterpoint to the official version. The secrecy she describes is not theatrical, it is practical. It is the sound of footsteps changing direction when a carriage arrives unannounced, the sudden hush in a corridor when a door opens from a room that does not exist on any printed floor plan. It is the way a butler's hand lingers for half a second on the handle of a decanter before pouring for a guest whose name will never be mentioned aloud. And then there are the objects. Archives preserve invitations, photographs, printed menus. The diary mentions things that do not appear there. A handwritten list of attendees that is burned after use. A seating plan with one chair unmarked, known only to those who needed to know. A single card bearing a name that later reappears in connection with a financial maneuver benefiting the family. In one of the later entries tied to this period, she describes helping to clear a sideboard after yet another unrecorded dinner. Among the silver and glass, she finds a folded piece of card left behind, its edges smudged with candle soot. On the front, in elegant script, is the name of a man the newspapers never place inside the Vanderbilt home on that date. On the back, in a hurried hand she recognizes as belonging to a senior family member, there are only 3 words: no mention, ever. In houses like the Breakers, the guest list was more than a formality. It was a kind of currency. Names written in good ink on thick paper meant alliances, recognition, and social elevation. Who came through those doors, and more. Importantly, who could prove they had been there, mattered deeply in a Gilded Age world obsessed with position. Officially, every significant visitor left a trace, a calling card in a silver tray, an entry in the household book, a mention in the paper if their presence served the family's story. Unofficially, there was a second layer of arrivals that existed only in candlelight and in the quiet memory of those who worked in the shadows. The diary lingers on this distinction with an almost forensic calm. On one page, she lists the expected guests for a well-publicized reception: industrialists, judges, a senator whose name would be familiar to anyone reading turn-of-the-century headlines. On another, written in smaller script and clearly added after the fact, she notes a different set of arrivals for that same week. Men who came late, alone or in pairs, their carriages pulling up not at the main entrance but at a side door near the service courtyard. No flowers waiting for them, no footman-lined in formal rows. Just a single servant with a lantern, and sometimes the head housekeeper herself, standing with a folded piece of paper in her hand, a handwritten list to verify who had been promised discretion. In the formal household register, preserved for posterity, these visits do not exist. The book turns from one day to the next without interruption, its columns filled with tidy lines about family only, quiet evening, no callers, yet the diary describes rooms being aired that night, lamps trimmed, glasses laid out inside small salons well away from the grand ballroom. It mentions how the curtains in those spaces were drawn before the first carriage arrived, and how the doors were kept just ajar, long enough for a figure in a dark overcoat to slip through before being closed again. The staff moved carefully, steps softened, voices lowered. To anyone standing outside the gates, the mansion would have seemed wrapped in sleep. She is methodical about the fragments she records. Beside dates that align with key moments in the expansion of rail lines or negotiations over new banking ventures, she notes the appearance of gentlemen not entered in the book. No titles, no full descriptions, just enough to suggest that these were not ordinary callers. More than once she writes that the guest asked to see the study, not the drawing room, a small detail that tells you where real decisions were made. The drawing room was for show, a place for music and conversation under painted ceilings. The study, with its heavy desk and locked drawers, was where contracts could be discussed without witnesses, while the only silent witnesses were the ones pouring brandy and clearing plates, people who, in theory, did not count. Sometimes, she explains, the only written evidence of these gatherings were slips of paper passed into her hand before dawn, a list of initials to be matched against arrivals during the night, then burned in the kitchen stove once. Everyone had gone. These lists never joined the bound registers that historians later photographed and cataloged. They existed for a few hours, long enough to ensure no one uninvited was seen, then turned to ash along with coffee grounds and food scraps. Yet she writes them down again in her own way, not copying the names, but marking the fact that there had been names and that they were not meant to survive. In an age whose fortunes rested on railroads, emerging banks, and public works, it is hard not to imagine that some of these men carried more than simple social calls in their pockets. The politics of those rooms rarely left a visible mark, but their timing is suggestive. A late-night visit coincides with a favorable mention of Vanderbilt investments in the financial press. A series of unregistered dinners lines up neatly with the final stages of a disputed contract for a new line of track or a harbor improvement funded largely by private capital. There are hints of loans, extended quietly, of guarantees made off the record, of influence promised in exchange for stability or silence. If you read only the newspapers, you see sudden decisions that seem to arrive fully formed. If you read her handwriting alongside them, you begin to glimpse the long evenings of negotiation by lamplight that preceded those announcements. All of this required a careful choreography of visibility and erasure. The Gilded Age loved spectacle, but it understood that power often needed the opposite. The same house that opened its doors wide for charity balls also knew how to fold itself inward for nights that did not belong on public calendars. The head housekeeper, standing between those two modes, watched the way reputation was curated, which names were encouraged to be seen and photographed, which were ushered in when the cameras were gone. The price of protecting a legacy, the diary suggests, was not only measured in donations and monuments, but also in the quiet agreement that certain meetings would never be acknowledged. There is a kind of guilt that shows up not in confessions but in precaution. You hear it in the way a voice drops at the mention of a particular visitor, see it in the way a hand hovers a fraction too long over the guest book before turning the page without writing anything down. The staff learned to read these small signals. A footman glances quickly toward the head housekeeper when an unexpected carriage arrives. A maid lingers near a stairwell just long enough to make sure a hallway has emptied before a door opens from a room that the family insists is used only for storage. These are not dramatic gestures, but they carry the weight of Golden Age secrets, an understanding that certain alliances, certain promises, could not survive exposure. Years later, when archivists look back at the official documents, the record seems clean. Guest lists align with published accounts. Invitations match newspaper reports. Photographs show only the approved faces in their proper rooms. Nothing about those pages suggests that entire conversations, perhaps decisions affecting towns and workforces far from Newport's cliffs, took place without leaving a trace that can be cited or footnoted. The people who stood in those forbidden rooms, who spoke softly by candlelight while maps and papers lay on polished tables, are absent from the archives. They exist only as impressions in the diary. Man with scar on left hand. Banker from New York not announced. Engineer seated far from windows. The pattern that emerges is not one of isolated impropriety. but of a system designed to let certain things happen without ever becoming part of the official story. Agreements struck at midnight carried forward into contracts that bore no mention of where the conversation began. Promises made over brandy in a house on the Atlantic coast shaped investments, construction sites, and labor conditions hundreds of miles away. Yet if you asked the family or their public defenders decades later, they could point calmly to the records and say, "There is nothing here to suggest anything unusual." And strictly speaking, they would be right. The erased records were never intended to reach those ledgers. The diary, small and unassuming, sits exactly in that absence. It does not claim to reveal every detail, but it insists that the blank spaces are not innocent. It reminds us that behind every immaculate guest book from the Gilded Age there may have been another set of names, written on paper thin enough to burn quickly. When you imagine those nights, you might picture the long table in a quiet room, lit only by low lamps, men leaning over maps, their shadows doubling on the walls while the house outside lies dark and still, and somewhere nearby, on a sideboard or a narrow writing desk, a second book rests open, a household register with neat, regular lines, while a single name, written there once, has been so heavily scratched out that the paper has begun to tear. In a house like the Breakers, power began with something as simple as the clock. Breakfast at a fixed hour, the same silver brought out in the same order. Coal delivered before dawn, so the grates were already glowing when the family's feet touched the polished floors. Mirrors wiped and curtains drawn back according to a schedule that rarely shifted more than a few minutes. Bells connected rooms to the servants' hall in a quiet language of their own, summoning. Maids and footmen in patterns as predictable as train timetables on a well-run line. The head housekeeper lived inside that rhythm. Her days were measured in repetitions, linens changed on certain mornings, rugs beaten on certain afternoons, corridors cleared before the first guest crossed the threshold. At night, once the last lamp was turned down and the final door was locked, the house settled into an order that could almost be read with your eyes closed, footsteps fading at known times, the kitchen emptying out, the clink of the last plate stacked away far below the glitter of the golden halls. That was the normal, the surface of the Gilded Age the public imagined, a great machine of service turning invisibly beneath luxury. It is precisely against that background of rigid routine that the smallest variations in her diary become so disturbing. On pages where mornings, for months at a time, are summed up in the same handful of words, usual preparation, regular service, one sudden entry stands out. Kitchen still active past 1 o'clock. On a night when the house should have been quiet by 11, she notes that lamps in a particular corridor of the family wing remained lit until after 2. In a place where doors to the upper floors were supposed to be locked at a specific hour, she records being instructed to keep a key nearby and to leave passage clear near the east staircase. None of this is theatrical. It is written in the same careful hand, but the pattern has slipped. Where the house usually follows its own strict choreography, the steps change, and they change on nights that align with those unnamed visitors, with the erased records we have already seen. Her job required an almost obsessive attention to such details, so she would have noticed even if she had not been writing. The usual patrol of the night watchman, for instance, followed a set route, from the main hall to the back service door, along the gallery, up a service stair, down another. She marks on one evening that his path was altered. He was told explicitly not to approach a certain landing between 10 and midnight. Another note describes how chairs that normally sat near a window overlooking the lawn were removed entirely to prevent waiting in that area. These are not accidents. They are calculated gaps, emptied spaces where no one is supposed to stand. No casual eyes are supposed to linger. The house, so proud of its order, rearranges itself for something it does not intend to admit. In the dining rooms and great halls, the protocol of the Gilded Age was a kind of theater. Courses arrived in sequence, servants entered and exited through hidden doors. Conversations rose and fell beneath chandeliers at volumes that matched the music. But in the diary, The most revealing lines are often about what happens after the curtain should have dropped. She notes, for example, that on a particular winter night, the scullery maids, usually dismissed as soon as the last dish from the formal supper was washed, were kept on in case of further use, even though no additional meals were scheduled. The kitchen, she writes, remained fully lit and at readiness, with coffee kept warm and a small table laid in a side pantry. No reason is given. No extra guests are listed. Somewhere above, in one of those forbidden rooms set aside for unrecorded meetings, the evening did not end when the official dinner was over. There is a quiet anxiety in the way these deviations cluster around certain dates. The house insists, through its routines, that everything is under control. Yet the routines themselves warp under the strain of what needs to be hidden. A maid is told not to light a particular corridor until a bell rings from upstairs, though that corridor is usually illuminated well before the family retires. A footman is posted at the turn of a stair he has never been asked to guard before, instructed to direct all staff to use the longer route around the gallery. Doors that are normally closed on empty rooms are left slightly ajar, not for convenience, but so the slightest sound inside, murmurs, the scrape of a chair, will not have to compete with the noise of a latch being turned. You can almost see the staff moving through these altered paths, their glances brief, their steps adjusted by instinct, aware that something is happening just out of sight. The head housekeeper herself does not dramatize these moments, but she does not ignore them. She records which keys were taken from the board and not returned until morning, which lamps were refilled twice in the same night, which fireplaces in rarely used rooms were ordered lit, despite no guests being announced there. Once she mentions that the family's valet appeared in the servants' hall after midnight with instructions to prepare clothing suitable for travel for one of the gentlemen, yet no departure was noted in the official log, and no carriage was seen leaving through the main drive. Was it a quiet exit through a back road? A trip meant to be understood not as absence, but as having never taken place? The diary does not answer. It is content to note the tension between the house as it is supposed to appear and the house as it must function to maintain its dark legacy. In a world where reputation was everything, the cost of acknowledging these anomalies would have been high. Servants who pointed out contradictions too clearly risked becoming part of the mansion's unspoken losses, names that vanished from payrolls and references, silent witnesses removed before they could say the wrong thing in the wrong ear. That unspoken threat runs under the ink of the diary. The head housekeeper never writes, "This is wrong," or "This is dangerous." She simply stacks the facts, the time, the corridor, the unexpected orders. As you follow line after line, you begin to understand that the weight of these small deviations is measured not only in what they enabled. Hidden heirs moved quietly through the house, forbidden rooms opened briefly for private councils, but also in the fear of what might happen if anyone admitted that the protocol was bending for reasons other than hospitality. Faced with these calculated breaches in protocol, would you call them out, or quietly accept that some doors are meant to stay closed forever? By the time the reader reaches the middle of the notebook, the very idea of routine in this Gilded Age mansion has begun to feel like a mask. The strict schedule, the polished surfaces, the predictable routes of servants and family alike, all of it forms a stage on which the most important scenes take place off script. When the house is at its quietest, when the official day has ended and the last carriage has supposedly rolled away, that is often when the real movements begin. A single bell sounds at an odd hour. A lamp flares in a corridor that should be dark. The kitchen door opens to admit a messenger who does not remove his hat, stays just long enough to hand over an envelope, then disappears into the night. No ledger records his name. No newspaper notes his arrival. But the diary does, anchoring him to the same sequence of nights when keys were missing from their hooks and staff were told to avoid certain staircases. In the language of archives and histories, these moments hardly exist. Official floor plans show the orderly arrangement of rooms. Service manuals describe ideal schedules. Letters in institutional collections speak of art, philanthropy, and travel. The diary belongs to another layer entirely, the thin stratum where reality presses up against the smooth narrative the family and their defenders constructed. Its power lies in the accumulation of these quiet breaks in protocol, these exceptions that only make sense if you accept that something sensitive was being protected, something that could not withstand the kind of light that fell so beautifully on the marble facade at midday. And it is in one of these entries, written toward the end of a long series of late nights and rearranged patrols, that she mentions an object that has no place in the house as it is officially remembered. A small brass key left by mistake on a side table near the servants' stairs, its teeth cut in a pattern she does not recognize, tagged with a number that does not match any door on the published plans of the breakers, and hanging just for a moment, in the air between her fingertips and the shadowed corridor where no one is ever supposed to go. In families like the Vanderbilts, the most delicate negotiations rarely involved banks or railroads. They involved blood. On paper, the lineage of a Gilded Age dynasty looked clean. Neat family trees, carefully chosen portraits, marriages that stitched fortunes together like embroidery. The public record spoke confidently of the eldest son, the suitable match, the future of the name. Inside the house, the diary suggests something more fragile. Heirs discussed. In lowered tones, doors closed a little too quickly, and the occasional unsettling phrase, "a child who must not appear in photographs." The head housekeeper moved at the edge of these tensions, close enough to feel their shape without ever being invited into the conversation. She writes of evenings when voices rose behind the heavy doors of the family sitting room, muffled but unmistakably sharp. Servants were ordered to remain at a distance, yet she was told to stay near the corridor, in case additional rooms are required. Later, she notes that one of the smaller bedrooms in a quieter corner of the house was suddenly prepared with unusual care. Fresh linens, toys taken discreetly from storage, a chair positioned so that whoever sat there could watch both the door and the window. No guest was recorded as staying there. No visitor's name appears in the official log. In her notebook, the room is tied only to a young person arriving without announcement. The diary never names this figure, but the details accumulate. A carriage arriving not at the grand entrance, but at a service gate used for deliveries. A woman stepping down first, veiled, her gloved hand gripping the doorframe a fraction longer than necessary before she allows the coachman to help her. A smaller shape following, guided quickly toward the side stair that leads to the less favored bedrooms. The head housekeeper notes the instructions she receives. Meals to be sent upstairs, no staff to linger, no mention. In the usual household counts, there is a sense of someone being placed inside the Gilded Age world, yet held just outside its official narrative, a presence in the house that does not exist on paper. Inheritance in such families was not only about who received what, but about who could be acknowledged as belonging. The logic of succession favored clarity, firstborn sons, legitimate lines, alliances that reassured investors and impressed society. Hidden heirs disrupted that clarity. A child born at the wrong time, to the wrong woman, or under circumstances that threatened the polished image of the dynasty, became a problem to be managed rather than a person to be celebrated. The diary hints at this management in small, revealing ways. She records a day when the family's attorney visits and spends hours in the library with closed curtains, while she is asked to provide tea not once but 3 times, each time for the same 2 gentlemen, no others admitted. That same week, she is instructed to have certain family portraits checked and adjusted before an upcoming gathering. She pays attention when the word "adjusted" leaves one of the ladies' mouths with an almost imperceptible pause. A few days later, as linens are changed and rugs beaten in preparation for guests, she passes through a corridor where the walls are hung with painted proof of the family story. Parents, children, generations framed in varnish and gilded wood. One portrait is missing, taken down under the pretense of cleaning. In its place for the moment, a faint rectangle of lighter wallpaper marks the space. When it returns, nothing obvious has changed for casual eyes, but she notices the way one small figure at the edge of the composition seems less distinct, as if a child standing close to a parent's chair had been brushed over, blended into the background until only the ghost of a shape remains. Her notes about children not to be included in the photograph run alongside entries about hurried wardrobe decisions and strained small talk. On the morning before an important family picture is taken in the Great Hall, she describes the arrangement of chairs, the careful placement of younger sons and daughters, the testing of light from the tall windows. Then, in a shorter line, she mentions a message delivered to her. Ensure that X is occupied elsewhere during the sitting. No name, only the initial. A tutor is instructed to take a child for a walk along the cliffs at precisely the hour when the photographer will be working. She sees the boy, or girl, through a distant window, coat buttoned to the chin, being guided away from the house while the rest of the family gathers in front of the camera, their future captured without the complication of an extra face. These choices did not stay confined within the walls. They rippled outward, shaping how the Golden Age secrets of the family were preserved in archives and public memory. When historians later consult birth records and society columns, they find a tidy sequence. So many sons, so many daughters, all accounted for in official announcements. The diary suggests that the truth may have been more crowded. A guest room that remains occupied long after a summer visitor is said to have gone home. Money set aside in a way that does not match the stated number of heirs. A distant relative offered a quiet position on an estate far from Newport, spoken of with a careful neutrality that feels more like containment than opportunity. Families in this world had well-practiced methods for dealing with such complications. Private sanatoriums, long visits abroad, sudden engagements arranged with surprising speed. These were some of the paths by which inconvenient stories were redirected. The head housekeeper, without access to the full reasoning behind each decision, sees only the surface. Trunks packed quickly, tearful farewells glimpsed from the end of a hallway, a name that stops being used in daily instructions and is replaced by a title. The young gentleman, the ward, our guest. Over time, those names fade from staff conversations as new servants arrive and old ones leave. What remains are small oddities in the way rooms are treated, in the way certain birthdays are not celebrated. The fear of reputations breaking under the weight of these secrets is present in the diary without ever being named. She notes how voices sharpen when wills and trusts are mentioned, how doors close more firmly when the topic of succession arises. On one occasion, she records fragments of an argument carried out late at night in a study near the forbidden rooms. Raised tones, a chair pushed back hard enough to scrape the floor, then a long silence broken only by the ticking of the clock. The next day, instructions change. A young person is to be moved to another property. Letters are to be forwarded there, not kept in the main house. The logic is simple and brutal. Better to rearrange lives quietly than to risk tearing the fabric of the name in public. If you've ever looked at a family tree in a coffee table history book and felt that something was missing, this is the shadow those diagrams can't show. In houses like this, silent witnesses were not only servants, but also those whose existence was acknowledged in private while being officially erased. The diary does not turn these people into heroes or villains. It simply refuses to let them vanish entirely. A description of a coat, left hanging in a wardrobe long after its supposed owner has returned to the city. A note about a small desk in an upstairs room being emptied and locked, with the key handed not to the usual steward, but to a senior family member who keeps it in an inner pocket. A reference to correspondence to be destroyed after reading. Written on the same day, she observes ash in a fireplace that had not been lit for warmth. What makes these passages so heavy, even now, is knowing how thoroughly the official story succeeded. The newspapers of the time do not mention disputes over unwanted heirs. They praise carefully staged engagements and respectable marriages. Public archives dutifully preserve what was handed to them, legal documents that support the cleaned-up version. The dark legacy of what the diary hints at, children redirected into other lives, relationships treated as threats, is left in the margins, visible only where someone close enough to see decided to write things down for herself. And it is there, in one of those margins, that she notes something small yet devastating. A visit to the family's private study to dust before guests arrive, where she pauses before a framed drawing once made by a younger hand, a simple family sketch in charcoal, and notices, upon leaning closer, that one face near the edge has been rubbed away so thoroughly that only a faint oval shadow remains where a pair of eyes once looked out from the paper. In a house like this, the servants were never meant to have opinions, only positions. Footmen, maids, coachmen, kitchen staff, each person placed within the machinery of the Gilded Age mansion with a clearly defined task and an equally clear limit. They were to move quietly, speak little, and disappear into the background the moment a member of the family entered the room. Yet the very structure that kept them invisible also turned them into the sharpest observers of Golden Age secrets. When you polish the same banister every day, you notice who pulls their hand back a little too quickly after a difficult conversation. When you stand with a tray near a half-closed door, you learn to read arguments by their pauses as much as by their words. In the diary, the head housekeeper writes about her staff with a kind of restrained care. She lists them in the margins: new maid for the blue room, footman from Ireland experienced, lady's maid reassigned from New York household, as if building her own internal register of silent witnesses. Over time, certain patterns emerge. Names appear regularly for months, attached to notes about reliable work, late hours, trusted duties near the forbidden rooms. Then, without explanation, those names vanish from her daily entries, replaced by brief remarks that say far more than they intend. Asked to pack quickly, ticket arranged for return across the ocean, no forwarding address left. Officially, these are simple changes in employment. On the page, they line up with nights of erased records and unregistered visitors. One footman, for example, is repeatedly assigned to the upper corridor near the family study, the same stretch of hallway where late-night meetings among senior relatives and their advisors seem to cluster. The housekeeper notes his discretion, his steady work, the trust placed in him to manage doors and lamps when the household wants no unnecessary eyes nearby. Then comes a short entry, almost brutally brief. Told this morning he is to leave by week's eye. And, no reason given, appeared surprised. The dismissal follows closely on the heels of a tense week she marks with other quiet anomalies: locked cabinets opened after midnight, a key checked out and returned under unusual supervision, a sudden visit from the family lawyer. No scandal appears in the press. The staff is told nothing. A replacement is hired within days. She describes similar disappearances among the maids. A young woman tasked with bringing correspondence to and from the study, always careful to keep her gaze lowered when stepping inside, is abruptly reassigned to another property inland, to be of better use there. The instruction arrives after an evening in which, according to the diary, raised voices escaped the edges of the study door, and a letter was burned in the fireplace rather than filed in the household safe. The next morning, trunks are packed under supervision. A carriage is ordered earlier than usual. The maid is given a modest reference and an envelope, handed over in the quiet privacy of the servants' hall. The head housekeeper does not open the envelope. She does, however, write that the girl's eyes linger on the corridor leading to the study before she steps outside for the last time. The economic logic behind this dark legacy is painfully simple. Staff lived where they worked, wages paid not only for their labor, but for their bed, their meals, their claim to any corner of the world at all. In such a system, silence was a condition of survival. To question why a trusted butler was suddenly gone, or to speculate too loudly about why a lady's maid had been invited to return to Europe, was to risk one's own place in the narrow shelter of the house. The diary never condemns the staff for their compliance. It doesn't need to. You can hear the pressure in the way conversations stop when a family member enters the servants' hall unexpectedly, in the way laughter in the kitchen dies instantly when the bell for the study rings at an unusual hour. What makes these departures more than ordinary turnover is their timing. Again and again, the erasure of a servant from the household coincides with the appearance, and disappearance of sensitive paper. The head housekeeper notes a ledger taken from the safe and not returned until late at night, now lighter than before. A locked drawer in the library stands open for the first time in months while two men speak in low tones nearby. Within days, a long-serving clerk attached to the estate's office stops coming to the house. Word filters back that his position has been restructured. No one is bold enough to ask what was in the drawer or whether the restructuring involved more than job descriptions. The diary simply places these events side by side and lets the reader draw the line between them. In an era when inheritance and succession could shift fortunes as dramatically as any market crash, documents were both weapons and shields. Wills, codicils, share agreements, private letters, it all mattered. A single page tucked into or removed from a file could change the standing of a hidden heir, alter the obligations of a patriarch, or quietly correct an inconvenient promise made in haste. Families like the Vanderbilts learned not only how to draft such papers, but how to unmake them. Fires burned hot in private hearths. Ashes were stirred until no words remained legible. Lawyers spoke of updated arrangements while avoiding mention of what exactly had been updated, or for whose benefit. The staff, positioned at the edges of these scenes, became silent witnesses to the physical movements of this paper world. They carried sealed envelopes to departing visitors. They cleaned ink stains from blotters that should have remained untouched at that hour. They emptied wastebaskets where, beneath ordinary scraps, the head housekeeper occasionally glimpsed shreds of parchment heavier and finer than everyday stationery. She understood the rules well enough not to piece those fragments together. Instead, she recorded what could not be burned: the sequence of events, the alignments of departures and arrivals, the way certain names disappeared from both guest lists and payrolls at precisely the moment a contested matter seemed to resolve itself in the family's favor. By the time the diary approaches the central event that will define its most unsettling pages, you can feel the cost of all this silence pressing in from the margins. The house has learned how to protect itself. Servants moved like pieces on a board, records adjusted, Golden Age secrets folded into the architecture of daily life. Yet something escapes the system. One document, or perhaps the memory of it, refuses to vanish cleanly. The head housekeeper hints at it when she mentions a set of papers removed from the safe and not returned, followed by a note, days later, that no such file is now acknowledged to exist. A clerk who handled the family accounts is quietly gone. Trusted footman is dismissed. The official archives, when consulted much later, show nothing missing at all. Only in the private pages of her notebook does a trace remain. A line about a folder once labeled with a particular year and subject. A folder she had dusted in the study more than once, now absent from the shelf. And on the desk where it used to rest, she writes that she found, overlooked beneath a blotter, a single brass label from its spine, its engraved title scraped almost smooth, yet still catching the light at a certain angle, revealing just enough of a word that the official version of events can never quite make sense again. In the diary, the night at the center of everything is not announced with drama. It begins like any other entry. A date, the weather, a brief note about the family having dined, simply, in the main hall. Only then does the pattern shift. She writes that, after the official supper ended and the guests retired, the house did not follow its usual descent into quiet. Instead, light remained under the door of the library beside the study, and a message came down to the servants' hall. Certain staff were to stay within call, others were to retire immediately and not return to the upper floors under any circumstance. It is a small sentence, but in a Gilded Age house so ruled by habit, it reads like a bell struck off key. She notes the arrival of only 3 men, 2 members of the family, and 1 visitor she describes with unusual specificity. Gentleman from the city office, previously here only in daylight. No one announces him. No card is placed on a silver tray. He comes through a side door, coat collar still damp from the night air, and is escorted directly to the library. The head housekeeper is instructed to have the fire well built and hot there, despite the season not requiring it, and to send up coffee and a tray with no alcohol. Only water. For a house accustomed to brandy over any serious discussion, that detail alone is enough to mark the moment as different. From the corridor, she can see only fragments. A tall safe in the corner of the library is opened, its heavy door swung wide with effort. Wooden boxes and folders are carried not from the safe itself at first, but from further down the hall. From the locked room near the unused staircase, a place she has already suggested belongs more to the realm of forbidden rooms than ordinary storage. The men speak in low voices as they sort through the contents: ledgers, loose pages, envelopes tied with string. Occasionally one of them steps to the doorway, speaks quietly to the trusted footman stationed outside, and sends him down to the study to retrieve another key, another box, another file that officially does not exist. What she records most carefully are the times: coffee taken up at 10:45, water jugs refilled just before midnight, the library door closed fully at 12:30 with instructions that no one was to knock unless summoned by the bell. From the servants' hall below, she hears the muted thud of the safe door being shut and opened again, the irregular rhythm of furniture being shifted, the soft metallic chime of coins or keys placed on wood. When she is called once more, near 1 in the morning, it is to remove the remains of the tray and to add more coal to the fire. As she enters, she observes, without lingering, papers laid open on the desk and on the floor, one box now empty, its contents in the hearth. The air smells sharply of burned ink and sealing wax. She does not guess at the exact nature of the documents. The diary has no appetite for fiction, but her language tightens around certain possibilities. The timing of this night coincides with a period of public unease, rumors in the press of an industrial accident on a line linked to Vanderbilt interests, talk of losses whispered in financial columns and then quickly corrected. She writes that, in the days leading up to the meeting, newspapers had been careful in how they described a recent incident, stressing confusion, unavoidable circumstances, and the lack of definitive blame. In the library, by the light of a deliberately excessive fire, 3 men read papers that, if connected to that same event, a faulty construction, an overlooked warning, an agreement signed too hastily, could translate confusion into accountability. Just before 2, she notes, a decision seems to have been reached. Voices drop even lower. One of the family members paces near the window, stopping each time at the same point on the carpet, hand brushing the curtain without drawing it back. The visitor from the city sits motionless, staring at a single sheet before passing it to the elder Vanderbilt, who holds it in both hands for a long moment, before placing it, deliberately, into the flames. The diary records that all 3 watched until nothing remained but ash. No one speaks as she is summoned one last time to clear the room. The safe is closed. The key is returned to its hook with an almost exaggerated calm. On the desk, where the boxes once sat, there is now only a blotter drawn slightly askew and a faint gray smear where ash has been brushed away too quickly. What follows over the next few days is as telling as the night itself. She observes a change in the house: fewer visitors, shorter meals, letters delivered more frequently by special courier rather than ordinary post. A footman returns from the city looking pale and withdrawn, answering questions with single words. A planned visit from a newspaper editor is quietly postponed. When the subject of the recent accident appears in print again, the tone has shifted. The language is firmer now. Responsibility assigned elsewhere. Assurances made that certain safety measures were always in place. Officially, any questions about negligence or hidden obligations seem to have been resolved. Inside the house, however, routines remain slightly off balance, as if everyone is waiting to see whether the fire in the library truly erased what it was meant to erase. In the public record, nothing of that night remains. There is no mention of a late meeting at the breakers, no note about boxes brought down from a sealed wing, no acknowledgement that papers once stored in a family safe ever existed at all. The archives show only the polished version: reports filed, inquiries closed, the Vanderbilt name intact, And yet here, in the careful script of a woman who had no power to shape the story, only to observe its shadows, we have the times, the movements, the objects that passed from locked drawers to open flames. Faced with such a precise account of something officially erased, would you trust the public version of events, or the testimony that survived, hidden between the fragile pages of a private diary? The diary does not say what those papers proved. It only insists that they were there, that they were read, and that they were destroyed with a deliberation that has its own grim clarity. When she returns to the library a week later to dust, she notices a small change. The safe has been moved an inch closer to the wall, leaving a faint mark on the carpet where it once stood. In the narrow space behind it, barely visible unless you bend down and look from the side, something thin and stiff has become lodged against the baseboard. A corner of parchment that escaped the flames, its edge darkened, its ink blurred, but with one surviving line, still legible enough to betray a date that the official files insist never existed at all. When you lay the diary open beside a timeline of the Gilded Age, something quietly unsettling begins to happen. Dates that, in the Vanderbilt house, are marked by late-night meetings, extended fires in the library, and boxes brought down from forbidden rooms, line up almost perfectly with entries in the public record that seem, at first glance, entirely separate. A small railroad company folding in a Midwestern town, a spur line abandoned in favor of a more profitable route, a local bank forced into reorganization after a failed construction project. In the newspapers, these stories appear as isolated misfortunes, explained away by market forces or unfortunate weather. In the margins of the diary, those same weeks are thick with unusual traffic in and out of the study. She never claims causation, she is too careful for that, but she cannot help noting that, 3 days after the night when papers were burned in the library hearth, a telegraph boy arrives with a message that keeps the master of the house at his desk for hours. The next entry mentions a hastily arranged trip to New York, no family present, and orders for certain staff to prepare luggage at short notice. 2 weeks later, she pastes into the back of her notebook a clipped column from a regional paper, a brief notice of a line deemed unviable, and a town left off the new route. The article praises the wisdom of consolidating traffic through a larger terminal farther away. It does not mention the families whose livelihoods were tied to the vanished depot, or the smaller investors who are now, quietly, ruined. For the people living near the tracks, the decision arrives as a rumor, then as a surveyor's new map, and finally as the slow dismantling of what once felt permanent. For the Vanderbilt mansion, it arrives as a letter placed on a silver tray, a conversation held behind a closed door, a dinner canceled because urgent business requires attention. The diary sits between those two worlds. It records the way the house tightens on certain days, staff dismissed from corridors, study doors kept locked, visitors turned away with polite apologies. Somewhere out beyond the Atlantic wind and the clipped lawn, a town is learning that its future has been decided. Inside, a servant finishes polishing the staircase before carrying coffee to a room where men are discussing that future as a line on a page. This is the invisible impact of Golden Age secrets. The fact that choices made under painted ceilings and electric chandeliers could determine whether a bridge is repaired or allowed to decay, whether a mill reopens after a fire or is left to rot as capital moves elsewhere. She notes, with her usual restraint, that on the same day a certain contract is signed in the city, there is relief in the servants' hall, rumors that the family's position is now secure. That security, glimpsed only in the loosened shoulders of a butler or the rare laughter of a kitchen maid allowed to keep her job, has a shadow on the other side of the ledger. Workers hundreds of miles away reading a short paragraph in a newspaper and understanding that their wages will simply stop. The logic of succession and legacy played out not only in who inherited the house, but in which towns thrived and which quietly withered. Archives preserve speeches about progress, commemorative plaques, photographs of ribbon cuttings attended by impeccably dressed heirs. The diary preserves something cruder and more honest. The way the household braced itself before news broke, the extra precautions taken around visits from certain city gentlemen, the deliberate effort to keep photographers away on evenings when decisions about adjustments were being made. The mansion, for all its marble and gilt, functioned as a kind of informal ministry, no elected office, no official jurisdiction, and yet a real power. Over rails, factories, and banks, families like the Vanderbilts knew how to use that power without appearing to wield it. They hosted public events that made them look like patrons, not arbiters. They donated to hospitals and universities, shaping gratitude that could later soften criticism. They cultivated relationships with editors and owners of papers, ensuring that when a contested decision had to be explained, the language would be gentle, the blame diffuse, the narrative controlled. Meanwhile, in the house, the head housekeeper noted which nights required extra coal for the library fire, and which mornings began with the faint smell of burned paper lingering under the scent of polished wood. By the time you reach these pages, it becomes difficult to see the mansion as merely a backdrop for society drama. It stands instead as a quiet engine humming behind the public face of the Gilded Age, its forbidden rooms and sealed cabinets forming a kind of shadow legislature. The staffs move through it as silent witnesses to cause and effect: a tense supper, a late carriage, an altered route on a map, a maid packing trunks for a sudden trip just as a temporary shutdown is announced in a distant factory town. The diary does not accuse. It does something more dangerous. It refuses to separate the private comfort of the house from the public consequences outside its gates. And it is there, in one of the final references tying an internal meeting to an external change, that she records finding something which should not exist together in the same drawer. A folded newspaper clipping reporting the closure of a small depot for the greater efficiency of the line, laid neatly beside a crisp, freshly drawn railway map tracing the new, more profitable route. Only on the map, in faint pencil, a first version of the line still lingers, passing directly through the town that has just been written out of the future. For someone in her position, writing at all was a risk. The Gilded Age depended on servant discretion as much as it depended on steel and rail. Secrets were to pass through the house like steam, leaving warmth but no trace. And yet, night after night, after bells stopped ringing and corridors finally emptied, the head housekeeper of this Vanderbilt mansion sat at a small desk in the servants' wing and turned what she had seen into lines of ink. No flourishes, no exclamation marks, just dates, hours, names, rooms, doors, keys. On the surface, it could almost be read as a meticulous work log. Between the lines, it becomes something else, a quiet refusal to let the dark legacy of the house belong entirely to those who controlled its official story. The tone of the diary is what makes it so hard to dismiss. There is no confession, no speech about justice. She does not accuse specific men of crimes or declare that hidden heirs were deliberately erased. Instead, she notes that a child is not to appear in any future photographs, that a certain room remains occupied but unacknowledged, that papers once kept in a labeled folder now exist only as ash in a library grate. She records the times at which forbidden rooms are opened, the days when the safe is visited outside its usual schedule, the exact wording of instructions meant to keep silent witnesses away from the wrong doors. In a world where Golden Age secrets were protected by carefully crafted public records, this plain, almost dry writing is a form of resistance precisely because it does not look like one. You can imagine her weighing every word. A more emotional text could have been dismissed as gossip, torn up, or laughed off. Instead, what she leaves is hard to argue with, the skeleton of events without commentary. It's the kind of record that, if ever questioned, could be defended as nothing more than a personal aid memoir, a way to remember which night the extra coal was ordered, which evening required more staff near the study, which guest arrived without a calling card. And yet, she chooses to preserve the details that intersect with power. The unexpected visits from city officials, the meetings in sealed rooms, the sudden departures of staff who had recently stood too close to sensitive doors. Between memory and control, she quietly pushes the needle toward memory. Why do that? knowing the risks. Perhaps it began as a practical tool, an extension of the same discipline that allowed her to run a complex household. But as the years pass and entries accumulate around forbidden rooms and erased records, the pattern suggests something more deliberate. She cannot change the contracts signed in the study or bring back the witnesses who have been sent away. She cannot challenge the logic of succession that pushes hidden heirs to the margins. What she can do is make it harder for the future to accept the official version unquestioningly. Her neat script becomes a thin line of ink running counter to the weight of archives shaped by the elite. For historians, that is what makes this diary so dangerous. It doesn't shout, it contradicts quietly. It lays the lived texture of the house alongside the curated narrative preserved in legal files and society pages. The Gilded Age image of benevolent dynasties, of inevitable progress and orderly inheritance, has to contend with the trace of a maid sent abroad unexpectedly after a late-night argument, or the note that a document once had a title before being burned. The diary insists, without ever saying it directly, that what appears in the archives is only what survived the flames, and that some fires were lit to choose what would survive. All of this was written without any expectation that strangers, a century later, would run their fingers along the same pages. Her audience was, at most, herself, a future version who might need to remember when a key went missing, when a name stopped being spoken, when a decision made behind a closed door sent ripples far beyond the cliffside lawn. And yet here we are, reading her against the official histories, asking what it means that this voice, never meant to be public, outlived the carefully polished documents that once tried to bury it. When the diary is finally found during restoration, wedged in that sealed drawer, it enters a second battle between memory and control. Conservators photograph it, archivists debate its value, descendants and institutions weigh what should be shown and what should remain in locked boxes. On one table lies the official floor plan of the breakers, pristine and reassuring, every room accounted for. Beside it rests her notebook, open to a page where she has calmly listed a set of keys and the doors they command, including one number that does not appear anywhere on the printed plan. And next to that number, in ink faded but still legible, a single word has been scratched over so many times it is almost gone, leaving only a dark, restless scar where a forgotten room refuses, even now, to disappear cleanly from the record. Once the drawer was forced open and the diary lifted into the light, the story did not simply move from secrecy to clarity. It moved into a different kind of control. Conservators were the first to touch it, laying it gently on white foam, turning pages with gloved hands while cameras clicked overhead. The ink was tested, the paper examined, the binding compared to other volumes from the same period. Historians were invited in, some leaning close with a kind of quiet excitement, others with their arms folded, eyes flicking between the cramped handwriting and the familiar official records they had spent years defending. Outside that small room, descendants and institutions connected to the Vanderbilt name were already on the phone, asking careful questions about context, about how much of this is really new, about what will be made public and what will only be kept for research. Debate over authenticity came almost immediately, and not always from a place of doubt. The more the diary held up under scrutiny, the dates aligning with known events, the references matching architectural features of the breakers and its forbidden rooms, the more uncomfortable its implications became. Some argued that it was simply a work diary, never meant to be read as a moral document. Others, tracing her entries against the dark legacy of Gilded Age expansion, saw too many convergences to ignore. In conferences and closed-door meetings, voices lowered when certain passages were read aloud, the mention of hidden heirs kept off the family tree, the late-night burning of papers that corresponded too neatly with erased records in corporate archives, the careful noting of visitors whose names never appeared in any other source. The ethical questions came next, and they did not resolve easily. Was it fair, more than a century later, to use the words of a woman who never imagined an audience, to peel back the polished image of a dynasty that had long since turned into heritage tours and coffee table books? Did the right to protect a family's reputation extend beyond the lives of those who had orchestrated the concealment? Or did the responsibility to understand how wealth and power were built, who paid the price for Golden Age secrets, outweigh that concern? In boardrooms and archives, people shifted in their chairs, glances darting toward framed photographs of the mansion in its heyday, while copies of the diary pages lay on the table between them. Museums and historical societies faced their own tension between memory and control. To display the diary openly would mean acknowledging that the official narrative, curated for decades, had always been incomplete, that silent witnesses from the servants' wing had seen a different Gilded Age than the one preserved in brochures. To restrict access, to keep it in a reading room known only to specialists, would be to repeat the pattern the diary itself exposes. Documents hidden, voices managed, truth filtered through those with the most to lose. In some conversations, the compromise proposed was almost surreal. Quote the passages about routine and architecture, but leave out the parts about hidden heirs and forbidden rooms. Mention her careful observations, but not the nights when keys to sealed doors were taken from their hooks and never logged. And yet, once read, her words are difficult to put back into the drawer. They change how you look at everything around them. The photographs of glittering balls, the neat family trees, the calm language of legal agreements. The question becomes not just what to do with this one diary, but what it reveals about how we narrate the past at all. How many other voices like hers were never written down? How many records were shaped quietly by the same instinct to protect a name and erase an inconvenience? When we walk through the restored halls of a house like the Breakers today, listening to guides speak of art and architecture, do we hear the echo of the servants' footsteps in the back stairwells, or only the polished story that made it into the official archives? In the end, the diary finds its way into a climate-controlled box, labeled, numbered, registered in a catalog that can be searched from anywhere in the world. A digital scan travels across servers, its pages flickering into life on distant screens, far from the sea wind that once rattled the mansion's windows. But the real weight of it may lie, not in the fact that it survived, but in the choices still being made around it. What is quoted, what is summarized, what is kept vague, for the sake of balance. Somewhere between the published histories and the private ledger of this head housekeeper, the story of the Gilded Age is being quietly renegotiated. And on a table in the archive reading room next to the open diary rests a pristine printed floor plan of the Breakers, every room labeled, every corridor clean, while a researcher, brows drawn together, slowly traces a fingertip along one blank stretch of wall and whispers the number of a door that every official map insists was never there. In the end, what survives of that world is not the roar of trains or the glow of ballroom chandeliers, but a small, discreet notebook that should never have left a locked drawer. It sits now in a glass box, surrounded by an ocean of digital files, servers humming, hard drives spinning, corporate clouds quietly sorting who is allowed to see. What? The contrast is almost absurd. On one side, a single hand writing by lamplight in the servants' wing of a Gilded Age mansion. On the other, systems capable of storing every email, every contract, every image ever taken of those same Golden Age secrets. And yet the struggle is the same. Then and now, power is less about what exists than about what remains visible. The diary exposes not just the hidden heirs, forbidden rooms, and erased records of the Vanderbilt world, but the machinery behind reputation itself. It shows how a family learned to manage archives long before the word database existed, how papers were selected for preservation, how inconvenient pages were burned, how silent witnesses were moved out of frame. Today, the tools have changed. Redacted PDFs instead of scorched parchment, legal holds instead of locked safes, press releases instead of carefully briefed society columns. But the instinct is familiar. The dark legacy of the Gilded Age is not only in what these dynasties did, it is in how they taught later generations, corporations, institutions, families, to curate the past in their own favor. Perhaps that is the real weight of this discreet notebook in an era of limitless storage. It reminds us that every archive, no matter how vast or polished, is also a map of decisions. What to keep, what to hide, what to pretend never happened. The Vanderbilt diary is only one example of a pattern that repeats from mansions to boardrooms. Silent witnesses, taking the risk of writing something down before it disappears, leaving traces that do not match the official story. And somewhere, in a climate-controlled room lit by the glow of a computer screen, an archivist scrolls through a digitized copy of that notebook, pauses, and then slowly overlays it with a high-resolution scan of an old household ledger, watching as a neat line of names comes into focus, until the cursor settles over one entry so heavily blacked out that the letters beneath are no longer legible, just a dark bar where a life has been carefully, deliberately removed from view. And so the image hangs there, suspended between centuries, a digital scan of a household ledger, the neat procession of names broken by a single, deliberate black bar where a life once stood in clear ink. Somewhere beyond that redacted line, we know a door existed that no plan admits, a room that no guidebook describes, a decision that never reached the official archive. The diary of a head housekeeper, hidden in a Gilded Age drawer, has simply allowed us to see the outline of what was meant to vanish. The rest remains in shadow, behind panels that do not open for tourists, in files renamed and buried in servers, in corridors where the dust lies undisturbed but not innocent. If you wish to keep tracing these faint marks, these forbidden rooms, hidden heirs, silent witnesses and erased records, stay close to these halls so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. Each comment another candle lit in a corridor the official story preferred to keep dark. And if this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again, that the quiet rustle of old paper and the soft click of closing locks still matter in an age of glowing screens. For those willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits, with another ledger, another portrait, another carefully folded document that does not agree with the version long accepted as truth. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.